So we typically think of Reconstruction as a failure. And if you take an American history course, they talk about Reconstruction as something that was unsuccessful. At the same time, we know that there was a prolonged violent insurrection that brought Reconstruction to an end. And that really poses a serious question for us about how you would need a violent insurrection to overdo something that is a political failure. So my research is investigating, number one, whether or not Reconstruction really was a failure. And then second, why Reconstruction needed to be ended violently, if indeed it was a failure. Okay. I'm Trevon Logan, professor of economics at The Ohio State University, director of the NBER's Working Group on Race and Stratification in the Economy, and a member of the development of the American Economy Program at the NBER. I'm an economic historian, and today I want to share with you some research I've been doing on what I've called whitelashing, which is the relationship between Black politicians and violence during Reconstruction. What I've been using for the last few years is data on Black politicians during Reconstruction. And the main source that I've been using is Eric Foner's Brilliant Freedoms Lawmakers, which is the most comprehensive source for Black office holders during Reconstruction. It is not comprehensive, but it is the best historical source that we have for all major Black officials. And why would that be important to have such comprehensive information about Black politicians? Because Black politicians had control over matters like public expenditures, poor relief, the administration of justice, and taxation policy, which is really important. In the history of Reconstruction, two big changes took place after emancipation. The first is the enfranchisement of freedmen. Literally, for the first time in the United States, millions of people were instantly enfranchised in Southern states who had formerly been enslaved. This led to the subsequent election of more than 1,100 Black politicians in various local offices, especially throughout the former Confederacy. What these politicians were able to do was to change fundamentally the way that public finance was structured in the South. Before emancipation, before the Civil War, the South had a very unequal economy, and it also had a very, very lax public finance infrastructure. In other words, tax rates were very, very low. Public goods were very rarely provided, and it actually had the form of embodying further inequality. So let me give you one example. Today, you pay your property tax assessments, and the government tells you how much your property is worth. But in the antebellum South, if you were a landholder, you told the assessor how much your property was worth. So imagine being able to tell your local county tax official, my house isn't worth $200,000. It's in fact worth $100,000, which forms the basis of the taxes that you'll pay. So this change in administration changed tax rates in the United States. But first, let's look at where these politicians were being elected from. And if you look at this, we see that there was a lot of Black political leadership throughout the former states of the Confederacy. From places such as South Carolina, which had the most Black politicians, to places such as New Orleans, which had the most in a particular city, Black politicians were elected to offices throughout the former Confederacy during this time. And in fact, a number of them served, and around 1,100 Black politicians would serve in office. The other aspect of this that I investigate in this research is what happened to them. About 10% of Black politicians were victims of violence during Reconstruction. That's an incredibly high number. Today, basically no elected official is a victim of any act of violence. And the specific acts of violence that they were victims of were actually quite horrific. Around 26% of them were physically assaulted. They were shot at, they were stabbed, they were beaten. More than 20% of them who were victims of violence received death threats. Nearly 28% of them were driven from their homes, and many of them, of course, were unable to return. Most surprisingly, 35 of the around 1,100 Black politicians were murdered. Now, I want to put this number into context because the death rate, the murder rate, homicide rate for Black politicians is around 2,300 per 100,000. That's the way that we calculate homicide rates today. There is no group in the United States that has a homicide rate above 110 today. So these Black politicians have a homicide rate that is literally 20 times greater than any sort of homicide rate that we would observe for any group in the United States today. And now we can use this information, and I take freedom's lawmakers and the politicians, and I match it to the data that we have historically about tax rates, and also to the information that we have about violence to derive an answer to these questions. So if we look at the changes between 1870 and 1880 in terms of taxes, we find a lot of different things. And so I want to set the context of this perfectly. 1870 is the first time that we have tax assessments that were decided by with the inclusion of Black politicians in policymaking. And what we see by 1880, when they're out of office, is that taxes per capita decline substantially. So in all counties in the South, taxes declined by around 10% after the end of Reconstruction by 1880. Now, if you had a Black politician in your county, your taxes in 1870 were substantially higher. In 1870, they're around $1.50 per person, and they go down to below 90 cents after the end of Reconstruction. So we can think about Reconstruction as being a very successful, the end of Reconstruction being a very successful tax revolt. If you look at the counties where Black politicians were not victims of violence, their taxes increased much less than taxes overall for the places where Black politicians were elected. And the decline in those taxes was a little bit less when we think about them relative to the 1870 level. But if we look at the counties where Black politicians were victims of violence, they were in fact the most successful politicians in terms of redistribution. So their tax rates were around $2 per capita in 1870. But note that by 1880, those taxes per capita are down to only 97 cents per person. So literally they almost have in the counties where Black politicians were victims of violence. And what we can see and what we find here is that the political violence of Black politicians was targeted to Black politicians who were very successful at redistribution. So the Black politicians who served in areas that had the most aggressive tax policies, and this included property tax assessment, taxes, for example, for public education, which was beginning after the end of the Civil War, taxes for infrastructure and poor relief, those were specifically targeted as political violence. So a dollar increase in per capita county taxes in 1870 increased the likelihood that a Black politician was attacked by more than 25%. That is an absolutely astounding estimate of the effect of tax policy on subsequent political violence. Now, in this research, I control for a number of historical factors. For example, was this a cotton growing county? Was this a sugar growing county? How large are the plantations before the end of the Civil War? A number of economic factors, for example, county wealth, the industrial mix of the county, and other sort of political factors, for example, the share of the Black electorate. And the result is robust to all of those inclusions. Another factor that I look at is whether or not this political violence is related to subsequent racial violence in general, which we typically can proxy for with lynching. And what I find is that there's no relationship between violence against Black politicians and lynching. And what I take from that is that the violence visited upon Black politicians was targeted to their political effectiveness in a way that lynching was not. Lynching was much more generalized racial violence. And so this project provides the first quantitative evidence that Reconstruction political violence was specifically related to the tax policies pursued by Black politicians.